Why did Spain authorize Columbus's expedition in search of a westward route to the Indies?
When Christopher Columbus, born Cristoforo Colombo, 1451–1506, who was Italian, became convinced that Earth was round. He had been studying the writings of Ptolemy, and that he could, therefore, reach the east by traveling due west across the ocean. He first took the idea to the King of Portugal to seek his financial aid. This was about 1483. The move was a natural one. He had settled in Portugal at the age of 25, married a Portuguese woman, who bore him one son before she died. And Portugal was the leading seafaring nation of Europe at that time, carrying out southbound voyages with the intent of rounding Africa and reaching the Indies to the east. But Columbus was rebuffed by the Portuguese monarch. When in 1484 he took his plan to the Spanish monarchs, King Ferdinand, 1452–1516, and Queen Isabella, 1451–1504, they too refused to back him. But Columbus persisted, and in 1492 the Spanish king and queen agreed to sponsor the explorer's plan. There were two reasons for the decision: the overland trade route to the Indies. India and its adjacent lands and islands in the Far East had long been cut off by the Turks, and the Western Europeans found themselves in need of finding a new trade route to the Far East. Further, Ferdinand and Isabella were devout Christians, as was Columbus, and they all shared a desire to advance the Christian religion. In short, the monarchs saw that there were both material and religious advantages for backing Columbus's expedition.
Are the Bushes the first father-son presidents?
No, the nation's 41st, George H. W. Bush, and 43rd, George W. Bush, presidents were preceded as father-son presidents by John Adams, 1735–1826, the second President of the United States, and John Quincy Adams, 1767–1848, the sixth. There have been other presidents whose relatives held the office before them: Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd president, was the grandson of the nation's ninth, William Henry Harrison. Zachary Taylor, the 12th president, and James Madison, the 4th, were second cousins. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was preceded in the office by his distant cousin, Teddy Roosevelt. Genealogists determined that FDR had ties to 10 other presidents as well. 4 of them were blood relatives and 6 were relatives by marriage: John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Ulysses S. Grant, William Henry Harrison, Benjamin Harrison, James Madison, William Howard Taft, Zachary Taylor, Martin Van Buren, and George Washington.
What was the Lyceum movement?
It was a public education movement that began in the 1820s and is credited with promoting the establishment of public schools, libraries, and museums in the United States. The idea was conceived by Yale-educated teacher and lecturer Josiah Holbrook. 1788 to 1854, who in 1826 set up the first American Lyceum in Millbury, Massachusetts. He named the program for the place a grove near the Temple of Apollo Lycurgus, where the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle 384 to 322 BC, taught his students. The lyceums, which were programs of regularly occurring lectures, proved to be the right idea at the right time. They got underway just after the completion of the Erie Canal. 1825, which permitted the settlement of the nation's interior. Just as the notion that universal, free education was imperative to the preservation of American democracy took hold, the movement spread quickly. At first the lectures were homegrown affairs, featuring local speakers. But as the movement grew, lyceum bureaus were organized, which sent paid lecturers to speak to audiences around the country. The lyceum speakers included such noted Americans as writers Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803 to 1882, Henry David Thoreau, 1817 to 1862, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, 1804 to 1864. As well as activist Susan B. Anthony, 1820 to 1906. After the Civil War, 1861 to 65. The educational role of the Lyceum movement was taken over by the Protestant-led Chautauquas.
What was the first animal sent into orbit?
The Soviets immediately followed the success of Sputnik 1, launched October 4, 1957, by sending the first animal into space, a dog named Laika. The female Russian Samoyed traveled in a pressurized cabin aboard Sputnik 2, which was launched November 3, 1957. Making her the first living creature to go into orbit. The trip ended badly for Laika, however, she died a few days into the journey. Before sending humans into orbit, both the Soviets and the Americans needed to prove that animals could survive in outer space. While the Soviets experimented with dogs traveling in space, by the end of 1958 the United States would send a monkey into space, but not into orbit. The following spring, May 28, 1959, two female monkeys, Abel and Baker, were launched into orbit in a U.S. spacecraft and were recovered alive. They had traveled 300 miles aboard Jupiter.
What is existentialism?
Existentialism is not a single school of thought but rather a label applied to several systems that are influenced by the theories of Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, 1813 to 1855. Existentialist thinkers consider one problem: human existence in an unfathomable universe. However, in considering this plight, philosophers have arrived at different conclusions. The founder of existentialism, Kierkegaard, rejected the principles put forth by traditional philosophers such as George Hegel, 1770 to 1831, who had considered philosophy as a science, asserting that it is both objective and certain. Kierkegaard overturned this assertion, citing that truth is not objective but rather subjective, that there is no such thing as universal truths, and that human existence is not understandable in scientific terms. He maintained that human beings must make their own choices, based on their own knowledge. When he wrote on the subject, Kierkegaard frequently used pseudonyms, a practice he defended by intimating that he was putting the onus on his readers to determine what is true, that they shouldn't rely on the authority of his philosophies. In the 20th century, heirs to Kierkegaard's school of thought included German philosopher Martin Heidegger, 1889 to 1976, who rejected the label existentialist, and the French writer Jean-Paul Sartre, 1905 to 1980, the only self-proclaimed existentialist. They grappled with the dilemma that human beings must use their free will to make decisions and assume responsibility for those decisions without knowing conclusively what is true or false, right or wrong, good or bad. In other words, there is no way of knowing absolutely what the correct choices are. And yet individuals must make choices all the time, and be held accountable for them. Sartre described this as a terrifying freedom. However, theologians such as American Paul Tillich, 1886 to 1965, reconsidered the human condition in light of Christianity, arriving at far less pessimistic conclusions than did Sartre. For example, Tillich asserted that divine answers exist. Similarly, Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, 1878 to 1965, who was also influenced by Kierkegaard, proposed that a personal and direct dialogue between the individual and God yields truths.
How many countries were part of the Axis powers?
The Axis, which was forged in 1936, included an alliance of three nations: Germany, Italy, and Japan. These major powers were joined by 6 smaller countries. The Axis satellites: Albania, Bulgaria, Finland, Hungary, Romania, and Thailand. But together these countries never comprised the unified front and strength that the Allied powers did. Germany started the war on September 1, 1939, and was joined in June 1940 by Italy and Albania. In the middle of 1941, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Finland joined the Axis effort. Japan, which was already fighting with China in the Sino-Japanese War, entered the fray on December 7, 1941, with its attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. Hawaii. Thailand was the last Axis country to enter the war, on January 25, 1942.
Is Thomas Edison the greatest inventor in history?
Some believe that he is, and for good reason, Thomas Alva Edison, 1847 to 1931. The so-called Wizard of Menlo Park, registered 1,300 patents in his name during his lifetime. More than have been credited to any other individual in American history. His best-known inventions include an automatic telegraphy machine, a stock ticker machine, the phonograph. 1877, the incandescent light bulb, 1878, and the motion picture machine, kinetoscope, 1891. Edison also made one major scientific find during his research, when he observed that electrons are emitted from a heated cathode. The conductor in an electron tube, the phenomenon is known as the Edison effect. When Edison was still in his 20s, he set up a laboratory where 50 consulting engineers worked with him on various inventions. By his own description, the Newark, New Jersey, plant was an invention factory. It operated for 6 years, during which Edison was granted about 200 new patents for work completed there. The laboratory is regarded by most as the first formally organized non-academic research center in the United States. By 1876 Edison had outgrown his Newark facilities and arranged for the construction of a new plant at Menlo Park, New Jersey. His most productive work was accomplished at this location over the next decade.
How did the Soviet Union fall apart?
Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's, 1931, liberal reforms met with the opposition of conservative communist officials who were angered by the hardships produced by the transition to a free market economy and dissatisfied with the Soviet Union's loss of influence over neighboring countries, where communism had fallen by 1990. On August 19, 1991, communists attempted to overthrow Gorbachev as president of the Soviet Union. Though the effort failed in the face of widespread public opposition, it nevertheless weakened Gorbachev's leadership. Soon the 15 Soviet republics declared independence but indicated their willingness to become part of a loose confederation of former Soviet republics. Though Gorbachev tried to prevent the complete dissolution of the Soviet Union. On December 8, 1991, the republics of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus broke away completely from the Soviet Union and formed the Commonwealth of Independent States. All the remaining republics, except Georgia, followed suit. On December 25, Gorbachev resigned as president, and the Soviet Union ceased to exist. With continuing reforms in Eastern Europe and the end of the Soviet Union, by 1992 the only communist-dominated countries that remained were, with the exception of Cuba, Asian nations, China, Laos, North Korea, and Vietnam.
What was the impact of the fire at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas?
The November 21, 1980, blaze, which killed 85 people and injured more than 600, led to a nationwide revision of local fire codes, giving the tragic event large-scale political significance. The MGM Grand Hotel had, in fact, passed fire inspections, but the building, which was then the world's largest gambling casino, had been 8 years in the making. Between the time it was designed, fire protection systems included, and the time it was built, the building no longer complied with the always improving safety standard for high-rise buildings. A short circuit started the blaze, which sent thick black smoke through the air ducts and escape stairwells. In the 21 floors of guest rooms, since more people were harmed or killed by smoke inhalation than by the fire itself, the American public became aware of the danger of smoke over and above that of fire. The event was a catalyst for change. Prior to the November blaze, most communities had not required existing buildings to be retrofitted every time fire safety codes changed and improved. After the fire, many communities chose to require building owners to comply with current protection capabilities.
Who was Hoyle?
Edmund Hoyle, 1671 or 1672 to 1769, was an English card player who, in 1742 at the age of 70, published short treatise on whist, which provided the rules for a game that developed into auction bridge and later into contract bridge. Hoyle's name has survived among bridge players in the phrase "according to Hoyle."
When was slavery outlawed in Europe?
The slave trade ended in Britain in 1807, when authorities agreed with the growing number of abolitionists. Those who argued that slavery is immoral and violates Christian beliefs, and outlawed the trade. In 1833 slavery was abolished throughout the British colonies as the culmination of the great anti-slavery movement in Great Britain. In the United States, the slave trade was prohibited in 1808, but possessing slaves was still legal. Consequently, trade on the black market continued until Britain stepped up its enforcement of its anti-slavery law by conducting naval blockades and surprise raids off the African coast, effectively closing the trade. The slave trade as it had been known officially came to an end after 1870, when it was outlawed throughout the Americas. Throughout the world, the United Nations works to abolish slavery and other systems of forced labor.
What are England's royal houses?
England's royal houses are simply families, including ancestors, descendants, and kin. Since 1066 England's rulers have come from a series of 10 royal houses. Normandy, ruled 1066 to 1135, Blois 1135 to 54, Plantagenet, 1154 to 1399, Lancaster, 1399 to 1471, York, 1471 to 85, Tudor, 1485 to 1603, Stuart, 1603 to 49, restored 1660 to 1714, Hanover, 1714 to 1901, Saxe-Coburg, 1901 to 10, and Windsor, 1910 to present. Prior to the establishment of the House of Normandy, England had been ruled by Saxons and Danes since 802. The first king of the House of Normandy was William I, also known as William the Conqueror c. 1028 to 1087, who was the son of the French Duke of Normandy. William invaded England in 1066 on the death of Edward the Confessor and the accession of Harold II. c. 1022 to 1066. Ousting Harold, William was coronated at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day. William's grandson, Stephen, was all that consisted of the short-lived reign of the House of Blois. Named such since Stephen was the Count of Blois and Chartres. Though he was raised in the court of his uncle, King Henry I, whom he succeeded. The House of Plantagenet, also called the House of Anjou, included the 10-year reign 1189 to 99, of Richard I, or Richard the Lion-Hearted, 1157 to 1099, who fought his father Henry II, 1068 to 1135, and his brothers for control of the throne. Richard's military prowess made him the hero of romantic legends. Thereafter, two contending branches of the House of Plantagenet, the houses of Lancaster and York, vied for the crown in the infamous War of the Roses, 1455 to 85. The struggle finally ended when Henry VII, a Lancaster, ascended the throne and married into the House of York, reuniting the two sides of the family under the newly minted House of Tudor. The Tudors were a famous lot, remembered for the reigns of Henry VIII. 1509 to 47, and his daughters, Mary I, 1553 to 1558, and Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603. The Tudors were followed by the Stuarts, whose reign was interrupted by the establishment of the Commonwealth and Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell, 1599 to 1658. The house was restored to power, giving history the 8-year period known as the Restoration. In 1660, it was King William III, 1650 to 1702, a Stuart, and Queen Mary II, 1662 to 1694, who began in 1689 to rule England in a more modern fashion through Parliament. A Stuart descendant, George I, 1660 to 1727, established the House of Hanover, which originated in Germany. Queen Victoria, 1819 to 1901, who presided over the Victorian age, 1837 to 1901, was of the House of Hanover. She was succeeded by her son, Edward VII, 1841 to 1910, who established the House of Saxe-Coburg. Technically, this is the royal house still at the helm today. The name was changed to Windsor during World War I, 1914-18.
Who was the first person to reach the North Pole?
There has been some dispute over this one. The credit usually goes to American explorer and former naval officer Robert E. Peary, 1856-1920, who, after several tries, reached the North Pole by dog sled on April 6, 1909, along with Matthew A. Henson and 3 Inuit companions. Unbeknownst to him, 5 days before this achievement, another American explorer, Dr. Frederick Cook, 1865-1940, claimed that he had reached the North Pole a year earlier. Peary and Cook knew each other. Cook had been the surgeon on the Peary Arctic expedition of 1891 to 1892, which reached Greenland. And for his part, Cook's claim was investigated by scientists. But the evidence he supplied did not substantiate the claim. Thus, Peary was recognized as the first to reach the northern extremity of Earth's axis.
How did CNN change television news?
When Ted Turner's cable news network, CNN, went on the air June 1, 1980, it was amid a fair amount of skepticism. Some thought the maverick businessman was ill-advised to air news around the clock to cable television subscribers. History would soon prove Turner's detractors wrong. 24 hours of airtime brought CNN something other news entities didn't have the time to do more stories and more in-depth news stories. The American public embraced the concept and soon began to rely on CNN not only to provide more information than other TV news sources, but for breaking news and up-to-the-minute updates on top stories. In 1991, during the CNN coverage of the Persian Gulf War, which CNN had more or less aired live, newspapers reported a phenomenon: Americans couldn't turn the news station off. Gone were the days of planning dinner around the evening network news or waiting until 11 p.m. to learn the latest. CNN and its sister station, Headline News Network, were news at the ready. At a time when the term global marketplace was quickly becoming part of the vocabulary of every working American, CNN was uniquely able to capitalize on the growing sensibility of a world community. In 1985, CNN International was launched as a 24-hour global news service. At first reaching only to England, by 1989 the signal was beamed via satellite to Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. CNN has continued to evolve its programming to cover news in every area of endeavor, with programs such as Business Day, Larry King Live, World Today, and Science and Technology Week, proving that the concept has staying power. The network, which began turning a profit after 5 years, has picked up multiple journalism awards, including the coveted Peabody Award. One of the early harbingers of CNN's success came in April 1982 when CNN won the right to be on equal footing with the major network news organizations in the White House press pool.
Why did Queen Elizabeth I have an entire age named after her?
Ascending the throne in 1558, Queen Elizabeth, 1533 to 1603, remained in power until 1603, a 45-year period during which England dominated the seas. To become a European power, colonization began. With Sir Walter Raleigh, 1554 to 1618, and others establishing British settlements in North America. Culture flourished, with the likes of William Shakespeare, 1564 to 1616, Christopher Marlowe, 1564 to 1593, and Sir Edmund Spenser, 1552 to 1599, producing literary masterpieces, and industry and commerce boomed. This was the Elizabethan age, one of England's high water marks. One of the most well-known events of Elizabeth's reign was England's defeat of the Spanish Armada in July-August 1588. This event has an interesting twist. The only child of Henry VIII, 1491 to 1547, and his second wife, Anne Boleyn, c. 1507 to 1536, Elizabeth had succeeded her half-sister Mary Tudor, 1516 to 58, as queen. In the summer of 1588, the invincible Spanish fleet, which was headed for invasion of England, had been dispatched by none other than Spain's Philip II, 1527 to 1598, Mary Tudor's former husband. Though the English were severely outnumbered, having only 34 ships to Spain's 132, they were aided by weather and defeated the Spanish Armada on August 8. This victory at sea opened the world to English trade and colonization. Queen Elizabeth was the last of the Tudor rulers who are credited with strengthening the monarchy in England. They were succeeded by the House of Stuart in 1603, when James I, 1566 to 1625, who ruled from 1603 to 1625, ascended the throne. It is that James who gave the world the King James Version of the Bible. He is also notable for having been the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. 1542 to 1587, whom Elizabeth I had reluctantly put to death.
How old is golf?
Some historians trace golf back to a Roman game called Paganica, when they occupied Great Britain between roughly AD 43 until 410. Romans played the game in the streets, using a stick and a leather ball. But there are other possible predecessors as well, including an English game, called Kambuka, a Dutch game, Kalf, a French and Belgian game called chole, and a French game, jeu de maille. But the game as we know it, the rules, equipment, and 18-hole course certainly developed in Scotland, where it was played as early as the early 1400s. The rules of the game were also codified there. The Rules of Golf was published in 1754 by the St. Andrews Golfers, later called the Royal and Ancient Golf Club. The first golf club, formed 1744, was the Honourable Company of Edinburgh Golfers in Edinburgh, Scotland. And it was none other than Mary, Queen of Scots, 1542 to 1587. Who is credited with being both the first woman golfer and the originator of the term caddy. The term is derived from the French term for the royal pages, cadets, who carried the Queen's clubs.
Who was Balanchine?
The name of the Russian-born choreographer is synonymous with modern American ballet. George Balanchine, 1904 to 1983, was one of the most influential choreographers of the 20th century, creating more than 200 ballets in his lifetime and choreographing 19 Broadway musicals as well as 4 Hollywood films. He co-founded 3 of the country's foremost dance institutions. The School of American Ballet, in 1934, the American Ballet Company, 1935. And the New York City Ballet, 1948, the first American ballet company to become a public institution. His entrance into the world of dance was entirely accidental. In August 1914, Balanchine accompanied his sister to an audition at the Imperial School of Ballet and was invited to audition as well. Though his sister failed, he passed and, against his own wishes, was promptly enrolled. However, Balanchine remained uninterested in the art form, even running away from school shortly after starting. The turning point for the young dancer came with a performance of Tchaikovsky's ballet The Sleeping Beauty, 1890. He was dazzled by the experience and chose to stay with the school's rigorous training program. Serenade, 1935, music by Tchaikovsky, is considered by many to be Balanchine's signature work. His other well-known works include Apollo, 1928, The Prodigal Son, 1929, The Nutcracker, 1954, and Don Quixote, 1965, as well as Jewels, the first full-length ballet without a plot. Remembering the opportunity he had been given as a child, Balanchine was known for choreographing children's roles into many of his ballets. His outreach did not end there. He organized lecture demonstration tours for schools, gave free ballet performances for underprivileged children, conducted free annual seminars for dance teachers, and gave free advice and use of his ballets to other ballet companies. Balanchine's unparalleled body of work was instrumental in establishing the vibrant style and content of contemporary ballet in America, where he brought ballet to the forefront of the performing arts.
What was the Red Terror?
The Red Terror was the brutal coercion used by the Communists during the tumultuous years of civil unrest that followed the Bolshevik Revolution of November 1917. After the revolution, the Bolsheviks, now called Communists, put their leader, Vladimir Lenin, 1870–1924, into power, delivering on the Bolshevik promise to end the country's involvement in World War I, 1914–18. Lenin immediately called for peace talks with Germany, ending the fighting on the Eastern Front. Germany and the other Central Powers would be prevented from victory on the Western Front by the entry of the United States into the war that same year. But the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, signed March 3, 1918, dictated harsh and many believed humiliating terms to Russia, which was forced to give up vast territories including Finland, Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldavia, and the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Meantime, Russians had elected officials to a parliamentary assembly. But when the results were unfavorable to Lenin, of the 703 deputies chosen, only 168 were communists. He ordered his troops to bar the deputies from convening, and so the assembly was permanently disbanded. In its place, Lenin established a dictatorship based on communist secret police, the Cheka. Further, the radical social reforms he had promised took the form of government takeover of Russia's industries and the seizure of farm products from the peasants. Lenin's hard-handed tactics created opposition to the communists, colloquially known as the Reds. The opposition organized their White Army, and civil war ensued. In September 1918, Lenin was nearly assassinated by a political opponent, prompting Lenin's supporters to organize the retaliative initiative that came to be known as the Red Terror. Though thousands of communist opponents were killed as a result, the unrest in Russia would not end until 1920. And some believe the ruthless repression of the Red Terror lasted into 1924.
Who was Dolly the sheep?
Dolly was the first mammal cloned from the DNA of an adult animal. She was a Finn Dorset sheep born in 1996 and was hailed as a monumental scientific breakthrough when her birth was announced in early 1997. Scientists at Scotland's Roslin Institute used somatic cell nuclear transfer (SCNT), a reproductive cloning method, to produce the lamb, which carried the same nuclear DNA as the donor sheep. The cells were taken from the donor's udders. Dolly made headlines around the world and launched a public debate about the possibilities and ethics of cloning. Over the years, research groups around the world reported the cloning of mice, rats, cows, goats, rabbits, pigs, a horse, a mule, and a dog. In 2003, Dolly was put to sleep, though she lived only about half the expected 10 to 12-year lifespan for a Finn Dorset sheep. Scientists who conducted a post-mortem Examination of her found that other than her ailments, arthritis and lung cancer, she appeared to be normal. The celebrity sheep was the mother of 6 lambs, which were brought into the world the old-fashioned way.
How did American Mary Cassatt join the Paris art world of the Impressionists?
Mary Cassatt, 1844 to 1926, the daughter of a wealthy investment banker from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, traveled to Paris in 1866 in the company of her mother and some women friends. The young Cassatt was determined to join the city's community of artists. Since women were not allowed to enroll in classes at Paris's Institute of Beaux-Arts, the policy was changed in 1897. Cassatt privately studied painting and traveled in Europe, pursuing her artistic interests. Returning to Paris in 1874, she became acquainted with Edgar Degas, 1834 to 1917. Who remarked that the American artist possessed an infinite talent and that she was a person who feels as I do. He made these observations after viewing one of her paintings at the Salon d'Automne in Paris. Cassatt went on to exhibit with the Impressionists in 1879, 1880, 1881, and 1886, gaining her first solo exhibit in 1891. Judith Barter, curator of American Arts at the Art Institute of Chicago and organizer of the traveling exhibit Mary Cassatt, Modern Woman, describes Cassatt as a very good businesswoman, who knew how to market her career. During 3.5 years of research, which she conducted to launch the exhibit, Barter explored the prevailing social climate of the day. The late 19th century was a time when feminists who organized to campaign for political and social reforms, eventually winning women the vote in 1920. Focused on maternity, encouraging women to be involved in caring for their children. To Cassatt, observed Barter, maternity was the highest expression of womanhood. Women and children were the subjects of Cassatt's body of works, which includes oil paintings, pastels, prints, and etchings. Cassatt's place among the Impressionists has often been overshadowed by her male colleagues, and her contributions to the art world are mentioned only in passing in many art books. But her talent, insights, and sheer determination combined to create an impressive legacy. As Gauguin quipped, Mary Cassatt has charm but she also has force.
Why was Eleanor Roosevelt called the People's First Lady?
While several first ladies before her had also been active in the nation's life. Eleanor Roosevelt, 1884 to 1962, wife of 32nd President of the United States Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, stands out as one of the country's most active first ladies and as a woman of enormous accomplishment in her own right. During her husband's administration, which began in the dark days of the Great Depression, 1929 to 39, and continued as the world again went to war, Eleanor Roosevelt acted not only as an advisor to the president, but as the president's eyes and ears on the nation, traveling in a way that his physical condition prevented him from doing. From the start, Eleanor Roosevelt remained in constant communication with the American people. She was known for her weekly press conferences, numbering some 350 by the end of the Roosevelt presidency, that were open only to women reporters. In 1934 she began a radio program, which became so popular that she was soon dubbed the First Lady of Radio. Beginning in 1936 she authored a daily column called My Day, which was syndicated to newspapers around the country. These forums gave the First Lady an unprecedented voice in American life, and gave Americans a clear understanding of their First Lady and her concerns. Concerned about the effects of the Great Depression on American children, she was instrumental in creating the National Youth Administration, which helped high school and university students complete their studies before joining the workforce. She was a champion of minority groups, declaring that the right to work should know no color lines, and resigning from the Daughters of the American Revolution when the group refused to allow black singer Marian Anderson, 1897 to 1993, to perform at Constitution Hall. Eleanor Roosevelt was known for getting out among the people. She lectured frequently and made other public appearances in which she met and spoke face to face with the American people. A famous cartoon depicted a coal miner pausing in his work to exclaim, "For gosh sakes! Here comes Mrs. Roosevelt." During World War II, 1939 to 45, she made a remarkable 23,000-mile trip across the South Pacific, where she untiringly visited American GIs in field hospitals and on the lines. MRS. Roosevelt was an advocate for the people, and it just so happened that she lived in the White House. A beloved First Lady who actively supported liberal causes and humanitarian concerns. She has been a model to subsequent First Ladies and women politicians and activists.
What does the UN do?
Representatives of member countries work to keep peace and ensure security for people around the globe. Over the decades, the UN has expanded its role as a provider of humanitarian aid and stepped up its efforts in the area of human rights. When disputes arise, the UN works toward diplomatic resolution. Though not always successful in its role as peacekeeper or peace negotiator, the organization has provided a forum for debate, which has prevented some disputes from developing into major wars. And through its various agencies, the UN provides assistance to developing nations, promotes humanitarian causes, and sends relief to war-torn areas. However, critics have charged the international organization with arbitrarily defining borders between countries, saying that these drawn boundaries divide ethnic groups and result in conflicts, such as in the Middle East and Africa.
Who was Emmett Till?
Emmett Till, 1941 to 1955, was a black 14-year-old from Chicago who was brutally mutilated and killed in the Deep South in August 1955. The young man was visiting relatives in Mississippi when he allegedly whistled at a white female store clerk. Till was sharing a bed with his 12-year-old cousin when two white men came to get him on the morning of August 28. He was not seen alive again. His body was later found in a river, tied to a cotton gin fan with barbed wire. An all-white jury acquitted the store clerk's husband, Roy Bryant, and half-brother, J.W. Millman, of the crime. The events stirred anger in the black community and among civil rights proponents in general, setting off the civil rights movement. For 4 decades, Till's grisly murder continued to deeply trouble many who believed justice could still be served. Though no one was ever convicted of the crime, and the 2 men who were tried for it had, by 2005, died, some of Till's family and friends, as well as investigators, believed others who participated in the lynching might still be alive. In a quest for clues, Till's body was disinterred in June 2005 to gather evidence. He was reburied in a quiet funeral. The Till family hoped the pending investigation would yield answers and justice.
What was the goal of the Lewis and Clark expedition?
The expedition, which began in 1804 and took more than 2 years to complete, had 3 purposes. To chart a route that would be part of a passage between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. To trace the boundaries of the territory obtained in the Louisiana Purchase, and to lay claim to the Oregon Territory. Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826, was President of the United States at the time, and he believed that a route could be found between St. Louis and the West Coast. As early as 1801, Jefferson had conceived of the idea that the Missouri and Columbia rivers might be followed west, leading to the Pacific. The journey would also be a reconnaissance mission. Information would be collected about the vast region and communications would be set up with its inhabitants. On April 30, 1803, the United States bought the Louisiana Territory from France. The purchase extended from the Mississippi River in the east to the Rocky Mountains in the west, and from the Gulf of Mexico in the south to British America, Canada, in the north. Jefferson soon picked his private secretary, Virginia-born Meriwether Lewis, 1774 to 1809, to lead the westward expedition. Lewis then chose as his co-leader William Clark, 1770 to 1838, who, as a lieutenant in the U.S. Army, had served General Anthony Wayne on the frontier, 1792 to 96. Beginning in the summer of 1803. Lewis and Clark undertook the necessary preparations for the overland journey. These included studying the classification of plants and animals, learning how to determine geographical position by observing the stars, and recruiting qualified men, mostly hunters and soldiers, for the expedition. On May 14, 1804, the Lewis and Clark expedition left St. Louis and headed up the Missouri River to its source. They then crossed the Great Divide and followed the Columbia River to its mouth, in present-day Oregon. At the Pacific Ocean, where they arrived in November 1805, 1.5 years after they had set out. They arrived back in St. Louis on September 23, 1806, having gathered valuable information on natural features of the country, including its flora, fauna, and the Indian tribes who lived there. The expedition had been helped by the addition, in what is now North Dakota, of a Shoshone Indian woman named Sacagawea, c. 1786–1812. Lewis and Clark had hired her husband, French-Canadian trader Toussaint Charbonneau, as an interpreter during the winter of 1804–05. Lewis and Clark thought that Sacagawea would be able to help them communicate with the Shoshone living in the Rocky Mountains, which she later did. Her brother was their chief. After the expedition, Lewis was made governor of Louisiana Territory, a post he served from 1807 to 1809. Clark resigned from the army in 1807 and became brigadier general of the militia and superintendent of Indian affairs for Louisiana Territory. In 1813 he became governor of the Missouri Territory, the Louisiana Territory less the state of Louisiana, which was organized as a state admitted into the Union in 1812, a post he held until 1821.
What were newsreels?
Newsreels got their start in 1910 when the pioneer film newsreel Path Gazette was shown in Britain and the United States. French cinematographer Charles Path, 1863–1957, and his brother Émile, 1860–1937, were Paris agents for the Edison phonograph. They visited London to acquire filmmaking equipment and secured financial support in order to set up production units in Britain, the United States, Italy, Germany, Russia, and Japan. These short movies, covering current events, were predominantly used during wartime and were shown in theaters before motion pictures were shown. Superseded by television newscasts, the last newsreels were screened in 1967.
When was the radio invented?
The radio, or wireless, was born in 1895 when Italian physicist and inventor Guglielmo Marconi, 1874–1937, experimented with wireless telegraphy. The following year he transmitted telegraph signals, through the air, from Italy to England. By 1897 Marconi founded his own company, Marconi's Wireless Telegraph Company, Ltd. in London and began setting up communication lines across the English Channel to France, which he accomplished in 1898. In 1900 Marconi established the American Marconi Company. He continued making improvements, including those that allowed for sending out signals on different wavelengths so that multiple messages could be transmitted at one time, without interfering with each other. The first transatlantic message, from Cornwall, England, to Newfoundland, Canada, was sent and received in 1901. At first radio technology was regarded as a novelty and few understood how it could work. But in January 1901 a Marconi wireless station at South Wellfleet, Massachusetts, on Cape Cod, received Morse code messages as well as faint music and voices from Europe. That event changed the perception of radio. Before long, Americans had become accustomed to receiving radiograms, messages transmitted via the wireless. In 1906 the first radio broadcast of voice and music was made. The event originated at Brant Rock, Massachusetts, on Christmas Eve, and the program was picked up by ships within a radius of several hundred miles. That accomplishment resulted from the invention of another radio pioneer, American engineer Reginald Fessenden. 1866 to 1932, who patented a high-frequency alternator. 1901, capable of generating continuous waves rather than intermittent impulses, it was the first successful radio transmitter. In 1910 American inventor Lee De Forest, 1873 to 1961, the father of radio. Broadcast opera singer Enrico Caruso's, 1873 to 1921, tenor voice over the airwaves. In 1916 De Forest transmitted the first radio news broadcast. Westinghouse station KDKA in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was the first corporately sponsored station, and the first broadcast station licensed on a frequency outside amateur bands. Within 3 years of its first commercial radio broadcast, which announced the election returns in the presidential race on November 2, 1920, Warren G. Harding won. There were more than 500 radio stations in the United States.
What is a poet laureate?
A poet laureate is someone who is recognized by his or her country or state as its most eminent and representative poet. Officially, a poet laureate is appointed or named by the government. England's first, if unofficially titled, poet laureate was Ben Jonson, 1572 to 1637, a contemporary of Shakespeare. Shakespeare acted a leading role in the first of Jonson's great plays. Every Man in His Humour, 1598. In 1605 Jonson began writing a series of masques, short allegorical dramas that were performed by actors wearing masks, for the court. Years later, in 1616, he was appointed poet laureate and in that capacity received a substantial pension. Among Jonson's works are Volpone, 1605, works, a collection of poetry published in 1616, and which includes the oft-quoted line, "Drink to me only with thine eyes, and pleasure reconciled to virtue," 1618. Some sources trace the first British poet laureate back to Edmund Spenser. 1552 or 1553 to 1599, who is called the poet's poet. However, the title of poet laureate was not officially conferred on an English writer until 1638, when poet and dramatist William Davenant, 1606 to 1668, who was reputed to be the godson or even the illegitimate son of Shakespeare, was given the honor. Other poet laureates of England include John Dryden, 1631 to 1700, William Wordsworth, 1770 to 1850, and Lord Alfred Tennyson, 1809 to 1892.
Who were the Angles?
The Angles were yet another Germanic tribe. They originated in Schleswig in northwestern Germany. Like other Germanic peoples, they were on the move by the 5th century. Arriving in England, the Angles joined the Saxons, also a Germanic-speaking people. After which time they together became known as Anglo-Saxons, a term referring to any non-Celtic settler of Britain.
Why were there two continental congresses?
Both meetings were called in reaction to British parliaments' attempts to assert its control in the American colonies. When colonial delegates to the First Continental Congress met, they developed a plan but were obviously prepared for it not to work, since even before dismissal they agreed to reconvene if it were necessary to do so. In short, the First Congress developed Plan A, the Second resorted to Plan B, which was one last appeal to the king, and then to Plan C, finally declaring independence from Britain. The First Continental Congress convened on September 5, 1774, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The meeting was largely a reaction to the so-called Intolerable Acts, or the Coercive Acts, which British Parliament had passed in an effort to control Massachusetts after the rebellion of the Boston Tea Party, December 1773. Sentiment grew among the colonists that they would need to band together in order to challenge British authority. Soon 12 colonies dispatched 56 delegates to a meeting in Philadelphia. The 13th colony, Georgia, declined to send representatives but agreed to go along with whatever plan was developed. Delegates included Samuel Adams, 1722 to 1803, George Washington, 1732 to 1799. Patrick Henry, 1736 to 1799, John Adams, 1735 to 1826, and John Jay, 1745 to 1829. Each colony had one vote, and when the meeting ended on October 26, the outcome was this. The Congress petitioned the king, declaring that the British Parliament had no authority over the American colonies, that each colony could regulate its own affairs, and that the colonies would not trade with Britain until Parliament rescinded its trade and taxation policies. The petition stopped short of proclaiming independence from Great Britain. But the delegates agreed to meet again the following May if necessary. But King George III, 1738–1820, was determined that the British Empire be preserved at all costs. He believed that if the Empire lost the American colonies, then there may be a domino effect, with other British possessions encouraged to also demand independence. He feared these losses would render Great Britain a minor state, rather than the power it was. Britain unwilling to lose control in America. In April 1775 fighting broke out between the Redcoats and Patriots at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. So, as agreed, the colonies again sent representatives to Philadelphia. Convening the Second Continental Congress on May 10. Delegates including George Washington, John Hancock, 1737–1793. Thomas Jefferson, 1743–1826, and Benjamin Franklin, 1706–1790, organized and prepared for the fight. Creating the Continental Army and naming Washington as its commander-in-chief. With armed conflict already underway, the Congress nevertheless moved slowly toward proclaiming independence from Britain. On July 10, 2 days after issuing a declaration to take up arms, Congress made another appeal to King George III, hoping to settle the matter without further conflict. The attempt failed, and the following summer the Second Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. Breaking off all ties with the mother country.
What is the Classical Age?
The Classical Age refers to the ancient Roman and Greek worlds, roughly 2000 B.C. to AD 500. The Classical Age followed the prehistoric era and preceded the Middle Ages. During this period, the ancient Greeks and Romans made contributions to literature, philosophy, science, the arts, and letters that are still relevant today.
What was the Reign of Terror?
It refers to the short but bloody period in French history that began in 1793 and ended July 1794. During this time revolutionary leader Maximilien Robespierre, 1758–1794, led a tribunal that arrested, tried, and put to death more than 17,000 people, most of them by guillotine. In the reforms that followed the 1789 oath of the Tennis Court and the capture of the Bastille, France was transformed into a constitutional state, and French subjects became French citizens. An elected legislature, the Constituent Assembly, was given control of the government. Robespierre was elected first deputy from Paris and was the leader of the Radical Popular Party. In this new era, those who had been associated with the old regime or those who opposed the French Revolution became the subjects of persecution. In January 1793 King Louis XVI, 1754–1793, and his wife, Marie Antoinette, 1755–1793, were executed, beginning the reign of terror that saw thousands more, mostly those who had made up the powerful First and Second Estates, suffer a similar fate at the hands of the revolutionaries. To escape certain death, many fled the country. This included top-ranking military officials, which made room for the rapid advancement of young military officers such as Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769–1821. The Reign of Terror ended on July 28, 1794, when Robespierre himself was put to death. As he gained power and influence, the revolutionary leader also had become increasingly paranoid, even putting two of his friends to death in 1794. He was overthrown on July 27 by the revolution of 9th Thermidor, and the next day died by guillotine.
Who were the conquistadors?
Conquistador is the Spanish word for conqueror. The Spaniards who arrived in North and South America in the late 1400s and early 1500s were just that, conquerors of the American Indians and their lands. In many cases, the Spaniards were the first Europeans to arrive in these lands, where they encountered native inhabitants including the Aztec of Mexico, the Maya of southern Mexico and Central America, and the Inca of western South America. By the mid-1500s these native peoples had been conquered, their populations decimated by the Spanish conquistadors. The conquest happened in two ways. First, the Spaniards rode on horseback and carried guns, while their native opponents were on foot and carried crude weapons such as spears and knives. And second, the European adventurers brought illnesses, such as smallpox and measles, to which the native populations of the Americas had no immunities, causing the people to become sick and die. By 1535 conquistadors such as Francisco Pizarro, c. 1475–1541, Hernán Cortés, 1485–1547, and Vasco Núñez de Balboa, 1475–1519, had claimed the southwestern United States, Mexico, Central America, and much of the West Indies, islands of the Caribbean, for Spain.